Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Henning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. This episode is being released on New Year's Eve, and I very much hope that 2026 holds better things for all of us. If Socrates was the gadfly of Athens, Diogenes of Sinope was the gadfly of Plato, Socrates' most famous student. We get several anecdotes about Diogenes and Plato's awkward encounters in the biography of Diogenes of Sinope contained in Diogenes Laertius' Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. It's a lot of Diogeneses, I know. There, Plato is said to have called Diogenes two things: a dog, Kuin, the root of the word Cynic, presumably for his yappy behavior, but also a Socrates mainominos, a Socrates gone mad. Plato evidently recognized that Diogenes shared Socrates' commitment to questioning social norms and pursuing truth over comfort, but saw Diogenes as having taken Socrates' shtick way too far, to an absurd and shameless extreme. From the same work, we hear that Diogenes once stomped on Plato's expensive rugs, saying, "I trample upon Plato's pride," to which Plato replied, "Yes, Diogenes, with pride of another kind." On another occasion, after Diogenes learned that Plato had defined a human as a featherless biped, Diogenes supposedly plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, shouting, "Behold, I have brought you a man." You really couldn't take the guy anywhere. But perhaps the most famous anecdote about Diogenes related to a meeting not with Plato, but with Alexander, who, at the time, in 336 BC, was not yet great, so to speak. This is the anecdote with which my guest today, Kuin, who has an appropriately Cynic-sounding name, opens her new and riveting biography. It's called Diogenes, the Rebellious Life and Revolutionary Philosophy of the Original Cynic, and it just came out last month with Basic Books. So this anecdote is attested by both Diogenes Laertius and Plutarch. Again, the year is 336, and Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedon, has just recently died. When Alexander travels to Corinth to assert his status as heir to his father's title of hegemon within the League of Corinth, every statesman and philosopher in Greece comes to congratulate him, except, that is, for Diogenes. Curious about what's up, Alexander decides to visit him in the suburb of Cranion. So Alexander finds Diogenes lying on the ground, basking in the morning sun. Surrounded by his elite guards and retinue, Alexander stands over the philosopher and asks, "Is there any favor I can do for you?" Diogenes barely looks up at Alexander, though, and only replies, "Yes, get out of my light." Even in his own time, it seems, Diogenes was enormously famous and influential. And here, Inger will be explaining both the arc of Diogenes' life and the nature of the ancient sources for it. And there are more and more reliable ones than you might think. Toward the end, we'll touch on Diogenes' enduring legacy for Cynicism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and even early Christianity. On a personal note, when I was growing up, my father used to tell me a story about a friend of his from school who was awoken one night by his own father, who was standing at the foot of the bed holding a light, and my dad can't remember if it was a candle or a flashlight. So when the startled son asked his father what he was doing there, the man answered that he was Diogenes, looking for an honest man, a reference to another anecdote about Diogenes preserved by Diogenes Laertius. Honest man, by the way, is the famous phrase, but that's actually an over-translation for the simple word anthropos. So, from Sinope on the shores of the Black Sea to Grand Rapids on the shores of Lake Michigan, you can't deny that Diogenes has proven a profound and enduring cultural influence. Inger's biography of him is an exciting and informative ride, and I hope that this episode inspires you to read it in full. Kuin is a researcher, writer, and teacher focused on the intellectual history of ancient Greece and Rome. She's associate professor of classics at the University of Virginia. Originally from the Netherlands, she splits her time between Charlottesville, Virginia, and Rotterdam, and publishes both in English and in Dutch. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. Remember, too, that Lesche is on Instagram at Lesche Podcast. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Kuin. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
My interest in Diogenes has two parallel paths. The one is that my dissertation research, this is now a long time ago, was into Imperial Greek literature. And in Imperial Greek literature, Diogenes is a hero. Like, people absolutely love him. So I was exposed to a lot of writing about Diogenes and engagement with Diogenes just through my more academic research. And then I've had an interest in public writing for a long time already, and initially I was doing that in my native language in Dutch for a Dutch-speaking audience to bring my research and my ideas about antiquity to general audience in the Netherlands. And that's where the Diogenes project started. And in a way, it started as sort of a very neatly historical project where it was like, well, there's not really a good biography of Diogenes in Dutch. Let me solve this problem for you. And then as I started on that project, I got really pulled into the philosophical side. And like my first approach to Diogenes was like, he's such a rogue. He's like so much a character who does and says things that other people only dream of. And he has such a strong appeal in that way. And then that roguishness to me like felt so similar to some of the roguishness that we see going on in contemporary populist politics and in culture more broadly. So I was like, okay, here's a rogue in antiquity. I really want to think more about this rogue and his appeal to people. So those were sort of my paths into the topic. And then I ended up writing in Dutch what I would call a philosophical biography of Diogenes that I was happy with and excited about. And then some friends started pushing me to also write for an English-speaking audience in the general audience market. And then I was like, all right, I should give this a whirl. And then when I found a publisher for this project, they wanted a much bigger book. The Diogenes volume in Dutch is pretty slim, compact, moves pretty quickly, does not have sort of so much signposting, etc. And then my American publisher said, we want more Diogenes. And I said, okay, I'll give you more Diogenes. So then I spend quite a bit of time first sort of finding my voice, right? What do I sound like when I talk to a general audience in English? And then also thinking about, well, what would be some fun ways to expand the book? And that was really fun. It's like a total luxury for somebody to say, hey, you wrote this book. Would you like to do it again and maybe add some stuff? So I was really, really thrilled to do that and ended up writing about 50% more. So the American Diogenes really is a lot bigger than the Dutch Diogenes ever was.
Did you find that your authorial persona changed? I mean, just even beyond the shift of languages, I mean, in terms of the shift of cultural context, do you think the personality that you assume as the narrator of the book changes between them?
There's more of me. I'm more present in the American book. And I think that makes sense. Like I'm more present as a narrator in terms of sort of giving context and sort of explaining where we're going, where we've come from, how it all ties together. So my voice already is more present as a narrator in terms of like providing structure. But then, especially in the opening of the book, I also talk a little bit more about sort of my own encounters with Diogenes. And those elements were not there in the Dutch version, which is sort of a little more sparse in that way. Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, so to move to Diogenes, can you give maybe just a general overview? What kind of dates are we talking about? And more specifically, what kind of historical context are we talking about? If he's a kind of Forrest Gump figure of Greek antiquity, like who are the people that he's running into? What are the events that he's witnessing? I guess paint us a little bit of a picture.
So he's born at the very end of the 5th century before Common Era in Sinope. This is a city on the coast of the Black Sea. Today it is in Turkey. At the time, it was really situated sort of on the border of the spheres of influence, Greek sphere of influence, Persian sphere of influence. And it's actually a contested region that changes hands in Diogenes' lifetime, right? So it's very much a mixed cultural area where cultures really meet. And he grows up at that intersection, right, where he can both be thinking of himself as as a speaker of Ionian Greek, as a Paphlagonian, as Sinopean. So these things really intersect.
It was great, just to interject, that you brought up that, I mean, you can imagine roughly 10-year-old Diogenes being present for the passing through of Xenophon and the 10,000. That was definitely a moment that made me pause and think that's really, really interesting moment.
Yeah, and this is something that I've added in the American version, and I was so glad to hit upon that, because in the sources that are directly about Diogenes, right, we don't meet him until much later on in his life, right? There's really sort of no one who ever says anything about what Diogenes was like as a child. So then I was really glad to be able to sort of find Xenophon's account of being in Sinope when Diogenes is about 10 years old, and to have a direct engagement with the people who are living there at the time, and especially to hear them talk about exactly that, how they can think of themselves as both Paphlagonian and Greek, and not sort of like one or the other.
Right.
Yeah. So then Diogenes, as an adult, is exiled from Sinope, and this is what brings him to Athens and later on to Corinth. And we are now in the early part of the 4th century before Common Era. And the people he meets in Athens are Antisthenes, another philosopher who was a student of Socrates, who's hugely influential on Diogenes' thinking, and Plato, another student of Socrates, of course, who he interacts with the most, right? So there's a lot of narratives that revolve around interactions between Diogenes and Plato and all the ways in which they disagree.
So he's a contemporary, sorry, just to clarify. So he's a contemporary of the group of people that we would probably think of as the Socratics, though he himself obviously is not a Socratic.
Absolutely. Yes. And so he is there in Athens in the aftermath of Socrates' death, which still reverberates, and
he probably gets tired of hearing about
it. Exactly. So, and he spends time with Plato and Antisthenes and other people who belong to that entourage, and he also sort of will later on become one of the answers to when somebody says, I'm looking for another Socrates, right? Some people will be compelled to say, well, Diogenes is the one you should be talking to. So this is sort of a really loud, really big part of the environment that he ends up in Athens. Then when he gets to Corinth, we sort of get to probably the most famous episode of his life, and also sort of the most important historical development of his life, is the defeat of the Greek cities at the hands of first Alexander's father, and then Alexander's coming to Corinth to get the support of the Greek cities to then go and march against the Persians. So in that sense, Diogenes lives through, I would say, one of the most pivotal times in ancient Greek history. And what's really interesting to me is that in some sense you would say, well, if you read about Diogenes, you really wouldn't know that, all right? Because there's a lot of sort of the more sort of nitty-gritty of the political historical developments that feel really far away. But then at the same time, we do get narratives about him meeting Philip, about him meeting Alexander, and of course sort of engaging with them in a way that's different from everybody else, and really sort of finding his voice as somebody who will go on to become extremely famous for speaking truth to power and not being interested at all or impressed at all by Alexander at this time, even though, of course, everybody else is.
So he seems like an important bridge in that case then from the Socratics to, let's say, the later part, the very last decades of the 4th century. What brought him to Corinth as opposed to Athens?
So these things we have to be quite careful. We can't be super sure about causality and chronology, but our best guess from a historical point of view is that Diogenes ends up in Corinth as an enslaved person. So he undertook a trip to Aegina from Athens and is kidnapped during that trip. Then he's taken to Crete, and this is where he is sold into slavery to a man named Xeniades, who lives in Corinth, who takes him back to Corinth and puts him to work in his home as a tutor, a pedagogue to his children, which at the time was a job that was done by enslaved people quite regularly. So in that sense, it sort of fits what we know historically speaking about that time. So that is what is our best sort of explanation for how he ends up in Corinth, is simply that he was brought there by Xeniades.
So is there maybe then a little bit of a life of Aesop vibe to him, and to this chapter of his life, particularly if he was enslaved at the time, that he dares to speak to Alexander like that?
Absolutely. And the way that his time in slavery will be interpreted, especially by the Stoics, is for the ways in which he maintains his freedom and maintains his own views and his independence in the way that he speaks, in the way that he acts, in spite of the fact that he is legally, socially speaking, enslaved. And in that sense, it's free. It fits very well with also his standing up to Alexander. I was going to say prefigure, but that doesn't work out historically at all, of course, because he is already enslaved and living with Xeniades, most likely at the moment that he meets Alexander.
Okay, so then what happens to him? Does he escape enslavement? Does he die in that condition, or what? What's his end?
Again, we can't be super sure, other than that he dies in Corinth, that people agree on, and we have no positive evidence to suggest that he regained his freedom in his lifetime. So it's definitely possible that he died an enslaved person. It is also possible that he was set free, but that we simply don't have specific positive information about that. But yeah, we do know that he spent the rest of his life in Corinth, and this is sort of what's interesting. If indeed we assume that sort of his arrival in Corinth coincides with him being enslaved by Xeniades, and if he also dies in slavery, that means that sort of all of the conversations and interactions that he has that we set in Corinth, that those must have happened while he was enslaved. And then we do have to assume that he had some sort of, was sort of spending a reasonable amount of time away from the home and sort of was getting the chance to interact with people outside in Corinth and in the cityscape. But again, those kinds of sort of meetings, those kinds of opportunities are not irreconcilable with what we know about ancient slavery and sort of what that might have been like and sort of the kind of freedom of movement people might have had. So on the other hand, there's some people that argue, well, he must have regained his freedom by the time he met Alexander in Corinth. Otherwise, this wouldn't have been possible. But I wouldn't necessarily go so far. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive.
So you've spoken a little bit to the difficulty of the sources and to getting a firm handle on him. Could you give a little bit of an overview of what the sources for his life are?
So in terms of what survives of sources from his own lifetime, there is, first of all, a mention in Aristotle. So Aristotle, also a contemporary of Diogenes, mentions him in his writings. This is in the Rhetoric. It's very quick. If you blink, you don't see it, but it's a very, very quick remark where Aristotle in the Rhetoric says something about a joke that Diogenes made. The other source contemporary to Diogenes' lifetime are the fragments of a guy named Anabasis, and Anabasis is one of the life writers of Alexander, and fragments of his works have been preserved by later authors, most notably Strabo. But he is also a contemporary of Diogenes and Alexander, and he writes about Diogenes and Diogenes' ideas, and he is a self-described follower of Diogenes and was alive at the same time, and we can read some of the things that he wrote. The other contemporary source are coins, and these relate not directly to Diogenes, but they relate to Diogenes' father. whose name was Hicasius, and he was the mint master in Sinope. And we do have coins that are from the early 4th century BC, from the right period, that show the name Hicasius on the coinage of Sinope. So that, in a way, is, to me, quite dramatic, right? If we think about the vast majority of people from antiquity, we don't have anything tangible like that, right? So that we have coins that have Diogenes' father's name on them, to me, is really exciting, right? I absolutely love that. Now, when we get past Diogenes' lifetime, the first notable source is a papyrus from the 3rd century BCE that has been dated to within the time that people who could have met Diogenes in person would still have been alive. And what this papyrus contains are some anecdotes, some stories about Diogenes being a smartass to people that he meets. And in a sense, these anecdotes are sort of quite similar to what we find in traditions that got written down only much later. The authorship of this papyrus text is not clear. It's an anonymous text, but one author who's been suggested is Metrocles, who was a Cynic who was a student of Crates, and then Crates in turn was a student of Diogenes. So that would be one possibility, but it could also be another Cynic whose name we simply do not know. Now then, when we move forward in time from the 3rd century BCE, we get to authors like Philodemus and Cicero, quite a bit later in the 1st century BCE, who write about Diogenes. And then when we get even later into the imperial period is when things totally explode and when you get a lot of writing about Diogenes. And some of that is very polemical, philosophical writing. Some of that is fan fiction, most notably Dio Chrysostom and Lucian. They make Diogenes into a character in their writing. But some of it is also doxographic in nature, where we get collections of things that Diogenes said and things that he did. And then we sort of arrive sort of at the far end of the chronological spectrum when we get to Diogenes Laertius. This is, of course, now quite late, but he draws on a lot of much earlier sources to collect his material for Diogenes. And just to sort of explain a little bit briefly my attitude towards this topic, there is sort of a very strong tendency to be extremely skeptical and extremely pessimistic about the sources for Diogenes, right? And arguments are easy to understand in the sense of, well, so much time has passed between Diogenes being alive and Diogenes Laertius writing down his text. How can we trust any of this? And then the second problem is a lot of these stories seem a little bit too good to be true, right? There's so much sensationalism, just so much crazy stuff going on. And in my book, I push back against that quite a bit. And the reasons that I push back against that are twofold. On the one hand, I think that sort of the state of transmission of information about Diogenes, even though, of course, we have to be critical of it and careful with it, there is a sense of a continuous transmission, right? People start writing about Diogenes in his lifetime. People also start telling stories about him orally in his lifetime. And this sets transmission in motion. And we can often trace the steps quite neatly so that there is a chain of transmission that makes sense to me and that is defensible to me and sort of works out. And my other issue is that Diogenes precisely is such a performative philosopher, and so much of what he says and does is precisely about a surprise effect, about a shock effect. This is how he gets his message across, to do really crazy things that are going to be very memorable, that people are going to want to tell their friends about and that get transmitted in that way. So then if we end up at the other end of the tradition, at the very end of the tradition with Diogenes Laertius, and people read these stories about Diogenes in Diogenes Laertius, and they say, well, that's such a good story. That's so crazy, so sensationalist. That cannot possibly be true. In the case of Diogenes, I'm not sure that that's the best approach, because he did crazy things on purpose. So if the stories about Diogenes are a little bit crazy, that's not very surprising to me at all.
Right, or at least you can kind of get some of the coordinates of the genre. I mean, I almost think of like, again, going back to like the genre of like the kinds, there is this Aesopic sort of anecdotal genre of these things that have an internal logic. Or like even if the pithy sayings of the Spartans get added to and embellished over time, there still is some core that is meaning bearing within the tradition, it seems.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that there are definitely cases where things get added to the Diogenes tradition that are hard to believe, for instance, because they are also told about somebody else, right? So the notion that Diogenes went and consulted the oracle in Delphi, to me, is a little bit too Socrates. And I don't put a lot of stock in that particular narrative about Diogenes. So those things do happen, but I think there is sort of a core narrative, and there is, for me, a core set of philosophical beliefs that I think we can trace with some confidence in the tradition. Yeah.
So you're open, for example, to being more believing potentially in the anecdote about Diogenes' encounter with Alexander the Great. Could you maybe say a little bit about that encounter and about why you do have this open mind about it possibly having some truth to it?
Yeah. So this is a moment that I am perhaps the most confident about, or for me, this is sort of one of the more certain events of Diogenes' life, precisely because of this character Anabasis, who I just mentioned. Because Anabasis serves in Alexander's army, is a self-described follower of Diogenes, and wrote about Alexander. So he was there in the right place at the right time, and he could have been an eyewitness to this meeting. Now, the other important part of the story is that the people who write about Diogenes meeting Alexander, especially in Greek historiography, are authors who use Anabasis, right? So, for instance, Plutarch and Appian, they write about Alexander and Diogenes meeting, and they also use Anabasis' writing in their own writing. So for me, that makes it quite clear that most likely Anabasis wrote about this meeting. Sadly, this is not a fragment that survives. If this is a fragment that survived of Anabasis, then this whole thing would be much easier. Nonetheless, that he wrote about it, and that Appian could still read this, perhaps in a compilation or perhaps in a full text of Anabasis, to me seems to be the most likely course of events. And there are actually some scholars who agree with me on that, who will say Plutarch and Appian, they get this story from Anabasis, and this is why we still read about it. But then ultimately, in this particular case, they draw the conclusion, well, Anabasis must have made it up because it is too good to be true. And here I feel like, well, that to me is just too skeptical. I really do think it's more likely that it happened and that Anabasis was there than that Anabasis would make this up about his own contemporaries, right? People he knows, people who are alive at the same time as him.
In terms of Alexander himself, what do you think that, what was the reputation already of Diogenes at this time? I guess maybe this is another way of asking, for someone of Alexander's day, if he had in mind the philosophy of Diogenes, what would come to mind for him? What kinds of ideas had Diogenes already been starting to project and live and spread?
The sheer fact of him living outside, not living in a house, of him projecting worldly possessions, was something that he was known for. And I think one way to encapsulate this is that Plato famously calls Diogenes two things. He calls him a dog, and he calls him a raving Socrates. The dog part has a lot to do with the aggressive way in which he answers questions and the aggressive verbal way in which he engages with other people. But it also has something to do with his shamelessness and the way that he's not interested in reputation and in the way that he inhabits his body in many ways more like an animal than like an elite Athenian, so to speak. When it comes to the label raving Socrates, Plato is acknowledging clearly that there are things about Socrates' thought that Diogenes is carrying on. And I think those are devoting his life to philosophy and seeing this as a good, but also very sober existence, right? The idea of Socrates going around barefoot. This is something that Diogenes then pushes even further, right? So in this moment in time when Alexander would have learned about Diogenes, I think he was known as an eccentric but intriguing figure who was living his life very differently from everybody else and who seemed to have somehow figured out a different way of living. And I think this is what Alexander must have been interested in most of all, sort of this eccentricity. And I imagine that this is something that Alexander had a curiosity about, right? Like how did this man figure out to live a fulfilling life independent from the prevailing societal structures and independent from what everybody else was doing?
And what were his views, in as much as we can reconstruct them or hear about them, generally on what we might think of as kind of your basic, like, polis religion, your traditional ancient Greek religion?
In my book, I end up branding him as an agnostic, somebody who, at the end of the day, did not think it was worth his time to really speculate about whether gods are or whether they are not. But he does not believe in providence. He does not think that there is a divine plan, right? So in that sense, he departs from the idea that we find in Plato, that the divine is somehow acting in the human interest and is promoting the human interest, is ultimately philanthropic, right? Diogenes very much sees the world as either governed totally by chance or at best governed by very capricious gods who may throw something very random your way at any given moment. His other engagement with religion has to do more with everyday practicalities of cult, right? So he'll make fun of people who pray for things that they could easily just take care of for themselves, right? Or who gorge themselves on so much food in honor of the gods that they make themselves sick, but then turn around and pray for health, right? These are sort of the kinds of inconsistencies, sort of the strange things that you find so easily in ancient religion that he pokes fun at, right? He also pokes fun at the Eleusinian mysteries and the idea that by engaging in some type of rites, you would get a privileged place in the afterlife. This is something that he considers to be quite ludicrous.
You write in the book about how he rejected or pushed back against some earlier thinkers, specifically when it came to epistemology. So how should we think of Diogenes in respect to maybe the pre-Socratics, but then also Socrates' famous maxims and his approach to knowledge?
So as is clear with respect to what I just said, to his agnosticism, right, that he is not all that interested in speculating about whether or not gods exist. In general, he is sort of a very staunch empiricist in the sense that he only is interested in discussing things that he can touch and feel, right, and that he engages with, right? So one of his famous meetings with Plato is about him sort of rejecting Plato's idea of forms by saying, well, I don't know what to do with cuphood and tablehood because I can't eat from tablehood. I'm only interested in tables, right? And Plato sort of seeks to mock him for this by saying, well, it's just because you're not smart enough to capture the forms. But this is not an insult that hurts Diogenes at all, because he is only interested in what's accessible to us through sensory perception. And so this is so far sort of a pretty negative view of philosophy, I would say, right? And
yeah, there isn't a Diogenes in metaphysics.
Right, exactly, right? So it's mostly about what philosophy should not be doing, right? And here he really departs very radically, both from pre-Socratics, who were so enmeshed in understanding the universe and the cosmos, and these are things that he turns away from. He also turns away very much from Platonic metaphysics, as I just said. But there's also a very clear positive side to his philosophy, and that is the notion that philosophy needs to teach us how to live, right? So philosophy needs to be about good way of life. And this good way of life is something for Diogenes that you do with your mind and that you do with your body. And at root, this is what philosophy is about. This is another way in which he turns away from Plato and Aristotle, because he defines this on the level of the individual. So for Plato and Aristotle, living a good life does require being in the polis, being in the framework of ancient Greek civic life. And Diogenes rejects this idea entirely and instead thinks that it is possible to define and live a good life outside of the role of living in the polis. And to me, what's very interesting about that is that in some sense, it democratizes philosophy, because it means that living, philosophically speaking, a good life is something that is open to everybody, right? That you don't need to be the head of your household, that you don't need to be participating in the assembly to live a good and fulfilling life, but that philosophy, as Diogenes defines it, is something that absolutely everybody can do, no matter what their gender is, no matter where they live, no matter what their wealth is, et cetera, et cetera. And this approach to philosophy is something that happens on the individual level and as something that is about living a good life as an individual is something that very strongly prefigures Hellenistic philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, but it is something where Diogenes, I think, is also a real innovator.
For the audience, you have really interesting sections and chapters on how Diogenes does philosophy with his body, a lot on his relationship with embodiment, which is really important. But I guess, at the time that we have, I think it's really important to ask, how is it that out of someone like this, someone who urinates on people and defecates in public and does all sorts of things in public and is generally seems like not super kind or gentle to be around, how comes it to be that he is the earliest source and this lone voice, as you describe him, of a critique of the general practice of slavery?
This, for me, I'm so glad you're asking about this, because for me, this was one of the most interesting and exciting parts of my research. We find Diogenes' approach to slavery mostly in sort of moments when he is being auctioned off to Xeniades. So these are sort of the important moments. And there are also sort of a whole set of sayings that are more about slavery in general, so not so much about his enslavement. The most important and most simple reason, I think, why Diogenes is critical of slavery on a fundamental level, unlike anyone else, is precisely because he places himself outside of the societal structure, right? So just as he can say, what do we need marriage for? What is so natural about marriage, right? He can also say there's something fundamentally unnatural about slavery, right? And precisely because he rejects the organizing societal hierarchical structures that are all around him, right? And because he challenges those, without those, as Diogenes sees it, there are no differences between human beings. And if there are no differences between human beings, then it becomes profoundly absurd to say that one human being is owned by another. And this is exactly what Diogenes says. And I think in terms of sort of other people who we can read and hear from Diogenes' lifetime and before and after, it seems like they were not able to think outside of slavery in this way, that they were, as it were, inhaling, breathing it too much. A difference between Diogenes and the Stoics' later attitude towards enslavement is that the Stoics will say, if you are a slave owner, you should treat your slaves well because, yes, ultimately they are also human. If you are an enslaved person, you just retreat within and you can still be free and you can still lead a good life. But because the Stoics are so focused on psychology, on mental well-being, they sort of don't really spend all that much time thinking about the material conditions of slavery. And I think it's precisely, and this is the second reason why Diogenes, to my mind, does reject slavery, is that he does not privilege the mind over the body, nor does he privilege the body over the mind, right? They are equally important, but it is because of sort of the embodiment of his philosophy that he is not going to be one to say, who says, it doesn't matter to be socially, legally an enslaved person in your body, just go within, right? Because this physicality is always going to be extremely important for him, right? He does not think that it is a good life to just retreat into your mind, right? Unlike the Stoics, who will say, yeah, material conditions don't matter. It's only about how we process them and how we respond to them mentally. Yeah.
Yeah, he seems to have this just complete radical commitment to freedom, right? Of individual freedom. I thought it was really fascinating, this, and maybe you could say a couple words about this notion that Aristotle himself, in the notorious passages of the Politics in which he develops his theories of slavery, that he might actually be alluding to Diogenes's positions on slavery, even if he doesn't name anybody explicitly when he rebuffs critiques of slavery.
Yeah, so in his Politics early on, Aristotle famously talks about slavery, and he mentions the anonymous critics of slavery. And as classicists, as historians, as philosophers, we've been on the hunt for these anonymous critics for a long time. And I have become convinced that when Aristotle says this, he is also thinking of Diogenes. And the reason is that what Aristotle says when he is describing the anonymous critics of slavery is that they oppose it on the grounds that it is contrary to nature. And this is exactly in line with Diogenes's understanding that nature stands above the law, right? And Aristotle says the critics of slavery, they think that slavery only exists in law and does not exist in nature. And then if they also think that nature stands above the law, then this sort of removes the groundwork for slavery. Of course, Aristotle himself will go on to say that slavery does exist in nature, but for Diogenes, that is a non-starter. And I think sort of these two different ways in which Aristotle talks about the critics of slavery both really point very strongly to Diogenes. And then I even go into sort of some verbal echoes in the way that Aristotle, of course, sort of describes human enslaved people as animals and as tools. And these are precisely the kinds of metaphors that Diogenes then goes on to make fun of, right? So when Diogenes is auctioned off, he says, well, if people buy a pot or a pan, they knock on it. But when they're buying humans, they just look at them. That seems kind of silly, doesn't it? And it is in that very moment that Diogenes draws attention to the absurdity of treating humans as a commodity, exactly the kind of thing that Aristotle is so comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this was a really exciting and unexpected finding of the book. I found it a very compelling argument. I know you discuss, and there are so many points that we haven't been able to cover in this conversation, and I know you discuss this at some length in the book, but could you maybe just give an overview of the impact of Diogenes' ideas? I guess maybe, starting from his own lifetime and then their evolutions into later times. And then you even bring it to the sort of New Testament era. Yeah, so within antiquity, what are the sort of vicissitudes of his reputation and legacy?
The starting point, I would say, is Crates, who was influenced by Diogenes and studied with him. Then with sort of in Crates' lifetime, we also meet his wife, Hipparchia, who is also a 3rd century BC Cynic philosopher. And these are sort of the most important names at this time. And it's very interesting to me that this sort of really important figure when thinking about philosophers in antiquity, Hipparchia, is a woman. And this ties back to what I said earlier about Diogenes redefining philosophy as something that absolutely anyone can do. So it becomes very logical that that opens up the way for having a female philosopher like Hipparchia. Now, Crates famously is the teacher of Zeno, and Zeno is the founder of Stoicism. And this then sort of is a very important path in a way that Cynicism takes, right? A big branch of Cynic thought gets translated into Stoicism. To a somewhat smaller degree, I think Epicurus is also quite influenced by Diogenes' ideas. So this is another branch that goes into. But Cynics also sort of continue to define themselves as an independent group and call themselves Cynics and continue to share their ideas. When we get to the early Roman Empire, we get to a time where there's pretty strong polemic. This is also, of course, in the 1st century BC already the case, pretty strong polemic between especially Stoics and Cynics. And so we get a lot of negative descriptions of Cynics, which are productive and interesting because they tell us something about how uncomfortable the Stoics were with their own Cynic legacy and how they try to set themselves apart. And then when we get to the moment when early Christians are sort of starting to show up in non-Christian texts and be described, we run into the very interesting problem that there are some moments where it seems that people have a really hard time telling Cynics and Christians apart because they are so similar in their rejection of wealth, in their itinerant lifestyle, in their sort of choosing of poverty, in their living in new social structures and those kinds of things. And sort of the debate over the level of influence of Cynic thought on early Christians is one that's really interesting, and I get into it in the book. I won't rehash it here, but let's just say that there's sort of enough, I would say, in early Christianity that reminds of Cynicism that it has given rise to a pretty strong debate.
So after this project, where are you left in terms of your own personal opinion of Diogenes?
Continue to be so impressed and grateful for his independence and his autonomy and the way that sort of his thought as a whole works to prop this up, right? So his sort of training of himself in a lifestyle where he can be happy with extremely little is in the service of not having to say yes to Alexander, not having to take anyone else's opinion into account, but to really be able to chart his own course and to really sort of be able to speak his mind and make his own choices because he is not indebted to anyone. He's not into service to anyone. He's not dependent from anyone. So for me, sort of just this core idea of trying to make up your own mind without being worried what other people will think of it or without being worried how it might impact you in a material sense, I think is extremely powerful, extremely important. The biggest place where Diogenes and I part ways, I would say, is his accounting of human connection. His understanding of independence and autonomy does not leave room for lasting interpersonal bonds, right? Because the problem with deep friendships or romantic relationships is that it opens you up to a lot of vulnerability. You become dependent on somebody else, and this is something that Diogenes closes out from his life. I would say he does interact with people, of course, right? I think every moment where somebody asks him a question and he gives them a philosophical answer, I do think those are moments of true interpersonal human connection that are actually really important. But he chooses to limit himself to that. And I personally think that when it comes to relationship with other human beings, that what you gain and how enriching it is to have those relationships really outweighs the cost of accepting a certain level of vulnerability in that way.
Well, maybe he had a bad breakup when he was young and just never learned to trust again. So for which we can be grateful. So, Inger, this season I've been ending the podcast by asking people, given the sort of general circumstances in which we find ourselves these days, what is something that you have been doing or watching or reading or listening to lately that has been bringing you some joy?
I love the Great British Bake Off. It's
a great answer.
It gives me no end of joy. So happy. Old episodes, new episodes, whatever we can get our hands on. Yeah.
Well, Inger, thank you. Congratulations on the book and how well it's doing. Thank you for coming on the podcast. It was great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.